The diner was loud with laughter, metal cutlery clattering against chipped plates, and the faint scent of burnt coffee that had long given up its fight to be fresh. Yet in the corner booth, she sat alone. Her name was Elena Ward, her back straight, despite the years of wear in her bones, her jacket old but neatly pressed, a silver insignia pinned quietly to her chest, the kind no one noticed anymore. She looked like any tired traveler, except her eyes carried something sharper, heavier, the kind of stillness that comes only from having seen the world break and rebuild itself too many times. The waitress passed her by 3 times without stopping. Teenagers at the counter glanced her way, whispered, and turned back to their screens. A man in a suit slid into the booth beside her, realized she wasn't who he was waiting for, and muttered an apology before walking off. She didn't flinch. She simply waited, patient, calm, invisible. When the owner, a broad man with tired eyes, finally walked by, he frowned at her coffee cup. "You gonna order anything else, Mum?" he asked, the tone not unkind but distant, the kind used for those who didn't quite belong. Elena smiled faintly. "Just waiting," she murmured. He shrugged and moved on. Outside, rain streaked the glass. Cars passed, headlights bleeding gold into puddles. Inside, the world went on, unconcerned. She rested her hands, scarred and steady, on the table. Every movement was quiet purpose, the kind that used to command respect. Now, it just earned looks of mild suspicion. At the next table, 2 young soldiers laughed over something on a phone. One wore the same patch she had once bled for. She noticed the details, the unbuttoned collar, the lazy way he slouched, the carelessness that came with peace. She almost smiled again, but there was something hollow in it. They didn't recognize her. Why would they? The uniform she wore decades ago had been replaced, her name filed away, her medals gathering dust in some forgotten box. Still, she waited. The bell above the door jingled. Cold air swept through, carrying a hush that rippled across the diner. A man stepped in, tall, shoulders broad beneath a dark coat. His hair was silver, not from age alone, but from battles that left their mark. His eyes scanned the room once, sharp and assessing. Then they locked on Elena. Every sound in the diner seemed to fold in on itself. The laughter dimmed, the clatter softened. The young soldiers glanced up, then quickly looked away, as if sensing something they didn't understand. The man, the 4-star general, walked forward with deliberate steps. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate. When he reached her table, he stopped, straightened his posture, and saluted. The gesture cut through the air like a blade, perfect, crisp, unwavering. The entire diner froze, forks hung mid-air. The waitress, who'd ignored Elena for half an hour, stopped in her tracks, eyes wide. The soldiers at the next table rose instinctively, confusion flickering into shame as they realized what they were witnessing. Elena looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. For a moment her eyes glistened, not with pride, but with something deeper, more fragile. Recognition, memory, the unspoken bond of those who had carried the same weight. The general held his salute for a beat longer, then lowered it with reverence. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "It's been a long time, Colonel Ward." A silence followed that seemed to stretch beyond the diner walls, through years of forgotten service, across the quiet graves of friends, through the long echo of wars that had stolen their youth. Elena nodded once. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The general smiled faintly. "You still sit like you're guarding a command post." For the first time that night, a small, genuine laugh escaped her lips. Quiet, restrained, but real. The tension in the room eased, though no one dared to speak. He gestured to the empty seat across from her. "May I?" She inclined her head and he sat. The waitress hurried over now, flustered, asking what she could bring. The general ordered coffee for both of them. The waitress nodded too quickly and disappeared. When she was gone, Elena looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He met her gaze evenly. "Yes, I did." The rain outside deepened, tracing new lines down the window. The general's hands rested on the table, large, steady, scarred like hers. "You trained me once," he said after a moment. "Fort Bragg. You taught me the meaning of command before anyone else did." Elena blinked slowly, as if searching through old memories. "You were just a captain then, and you were the officer who saved my unit," he said. "They don't write that part in the reports anymore." Her eyes fell to the table. "They never do." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts of honor, of all the moments the world had decided to forget. Outside, thunder rolled, distant but real, and inside that diner, for the first time in decades, respect found its way back to her name. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The general's eyes drifted toward the window, where the reflection of rain fractured the faint neon lights outside. Elena's coffee sat untouched before her, gone cold, yet her hands cradled the cup as though the warmth might somehow return. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was dense with things unsaid, memories too sharp to touch, names too heavy to speak aloud. The general finally broke it. "They told me you'd retired quietly, that you didn't want to be found." Elena gave a small, tired smile. "That's what retirement's supposed to mean, isn't it? You spend your life shouting commands, and then one day you realize the silence is your only reward." He studied her face, the faint scar along her jaw, the weathered calm in her eye. She hadn't lost the bearing of an officer. She carried herself with that same precise stillness that once steadied entire platoons. Yet now that stillness seemed like armor, not discipline. "They forgot you," he said quietly. Elena didn't answer. Her gaze had wandered to the soldiers still seated nearby. The young men who'd once laughed, now hunched awkwardly over their plates, stealing glances at her with something like shame. One of them had quietly removed his cap, resting it on the table in silent acknowledgement. She noticed. She always noticed. "I didn't need to be remembered," she said finally. "I needed them to be better." The general exhaled, a sound that felt like a confession. "They don't make them like you anymore." She gave him a wry look. "They said the same thing about your generation once." He smiled faintly. And they were right. The waitress returned, fresh coffee in trembling hands. Her eyes avoided Elena's, lingering instead on the general's insignia as though unsure how to behave. When she left, the hum of conversation began to rise again, cautious at first, as if the diner itself were unsure whether the world had shifted. But it had. Elena leaned back, her voice soft. "You ever wonder, General, what all of it was for?" He turned the question over slowly, like a weapon he'd held too long. "Every day," he said. "But then I meet someone who still carries it right. The weight, the discipline, the conscience, someone like you. And I remember that it wasn't all for nothing." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. The rain's rhythm softened against the glass, and the neon light flickered as if listening. Then the door opened again. A gust of wind swept through, bringing in the sound of distant sirens. A young man entered, soaked to the bone, wearing a black hoodie, his eyes wide with a kind of panic that didn't belong in a place like this. He stumbled toward the counter, breath ragged. "Please, someone call an ambulance," he gasped. "There's been an accident. Out on Route 7, a car flipped. Someone's trapped, chairs scraped." The soldiers leapt up. The waitress fumbled for her phone. But before anyone could move further, Elena was already standing. Her movement was sharp, instinctive, precise. The years melted away from her posture. She was no longer the quiet woman in the corner. She was Colonel Ward again, her presence commanding the air. "General," she said, already moving toward the door. He didn't hesitate. "I'm with you." They stepped out into the night as rain fell harder, slicing through the dark. The diner emptied behind them, curious eyes watching as two figures, one forgotten, one revered, disappeared into the storm. The wreck wasn't far. Headlights blinked weakly through the downpour, casting eerie light over the twisted remains of a sedan resting against an embankment. A young woman sat inside, pinned by the frame, her face pale with shock. Elena didn't pause. She assessed the scene in seconds. The angle, the pressure points, the risk of fire. Her voice cut through the rain, calm and absolute. "We need leverage under the door. You, grab that crowbar from the truck. And you, call dispatch. Tell them we've got one female, mid-20s, trapped, non-responsive but breathing." The soldiers obeyed without question. The general stood beside her, steadying the car door as she maneuvered into position. Rain soaked through her jacket, but she didn't flinch. When the metal finally groaned and gave way, Elena reached in carefully, her voice lowering to a whisper meant only for the frightened woman. "Stay with me, sweetheart. You're not alone." Minutes later, the rescue crew arrived, finding the woman conscious, breathing, safe. The paramedic, young, trembling, eyes wide, looked at Elena in disbelief. "You military?" he asked. Elena only nodded once. "Was," she said. The general stood beside her, rain running down his face. "Still is," he corrected quietly. By the time they returned to the diner, dawn was beginning to lift its first fragile light. The soldiers held the door open for her now, heads bowed slightly, eyes full of newfound respect. No one laughed, no one whispered. The waitress brought her coffee without being asked. And as the general took his seat again, the world outside seemed somehow quieter, as if the storm itself recognized her. For the first time in years, Elena felt seen, not for what she had done, but for who she still was. And yet deep down she knew. The salute, the rescue, the stares, they weren't about recognition, they were about remembrance. Because sometimes the world forgets its heroes, but the battlefield never does. The morning sun bled through the mist, washing the diner windows in pale gold. Steam rose from cups of fresh coffee, and for the first time the air inside felt reverent, hushed, almost sacred. Elena sat quietly, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the exhaustion she refused to show. The adrenaline that had kept her alive through the storm was fading now, leaving behind the ache of years she'd taught herself to ignore. Across from her, the general studied her face. He saw what the others didn't, the cost of composure, the 1,000 tiny battles fought behind steady eyes. She had saved a life that night, not out of duty, but instinct. The kind of instinct that doesn't fade with age or time. It simply burrows deep, waiting to be needed. Outside, the rescue lights were gone, replaced by the gentle rhythm of a town waking up. A few locals stood near the entrance, whispering in small, awed tones. They'd seen her emerge from the wreck, clothes soaked, hands covered in someone else's blood, moving with the same grace she must have carried on battlefields continents away. Elena didn't notice their stares. She was watching the horizon through the diner window, the same horizon she used to watch from military outposts, waiting for dawn to prove that survival had meaning. "You didn't have to go out there," the general said softly. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "I know." But she was calling for help, and no one was moving. Habit dies hard. He chuckled quietly, but his eyes were solemn. "You ever think about coming back? Not to active service, but training maybe. The academy could use someone like you." Elena shook her head slowly. "I've had my time. Now it's theirs, the young ones. The ones who still believe the world can be fixed." He leaned forward slightly. "You don't believe that anymore?" Her gaze flickered deep and far away. "I believe the world can be better, but fixing it, that's a fight without an end." A long silence fell between them. In that silence, the years they'd both endured seemed to hover. All the missions, the funerals, the medals that didn't matter, the faces that never came home. Finally, Elena sighed, her voice quieter now. "You know what hurts more than being forgotten? Watching the world pretend it never needed you." The general looked at her with a kind of understanding that didn't require words. He knew what it felt like, to walk through civilian streets and feel like a ghost among the living, to carry the weight of memories that no one asked about anymore. At the corner of the diner, the young soldiers from the night before stood hesitantly, their plates untouched. After a brief exchange, one of them approached, his expression uncertain but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you did last night, for what you've done." Elena turned toward him, her eyes steady. "Don't thank me," she said gently. "Just remember what it means to wear that uniform. It's not about power, it's about honor, even when no one's watching." The soldier nodded, his throat tight, and returned to his table. The general watched, something like pride flickering in his eyes. "That," he murmured, "is why you should have never faded away." Elena's smile was faint but real. You can't fade from something that's written in your bones. As the morning unfolded, People began approaching quietly. A retired sergeant who had once served under her command, a local journalist who had recognized the name from an old dispatch, even the diner owner, his voice thick with apology. One by one they came, offering handshakes, gratitude, and questions she didn't quite know how to answer. Someone asked if she would let them write about her. She declined, almost instinctively. "I didn't come here for that," she said softly. "Heroes aren't meant to be stories. They're meant to be lessons." The general watched her, deeply moved by the humility in her tone. "Then let them learn," he said quietly, "because lessons like yours, they disappear when silence wins." She considered his words for a long time, tracing the rim of her cup with her fingertip. Outside, the clouds had begun to break, the first strong rays of sunlight glinting against wet pavement. A bird landed on the railing, feathers slick with rain, shaking itself dry before taking off again. It was such a simple thing, but to her it felt symbolic. The storm had passed, and still life went on. "Maybe you're right," she murmured. "Maybe silence isn't the answer anymore." The general nodded. It never was. He reached into his coat and placed something on the table. An old, weathered commendation coin, the edges dulled by years of wear. "This belonged to my commanding officer," he said. "He gave it to me the day I earned my stars. I think it belongs with you now." Elena stared at it for a long moment. The coin bore the emblem of their old division, the one that had lost more than it ever gained. Her fingers brushed against the metal, cool and heavy with memory. "I don't need it," she said finally. "I know," the general replied. "That's exactly why you should have it." When he stood to leave, the entire diner rose with him. Not out of duty, but respect. Even the young soldiers stood straighter. Elena didn't move, but she watched as he approached the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame. "Don't disappear again, Colonel," he said without turning. Her answer was quiet but firm. "Not this time." As the door closed behind him, the sunlight finally reached her table. It spread slowly, bathing the silver insignia on her jacket in warm gold. And for the first time in a long, long while, Elena Ward felt at peace. She wasn't invisible anymore, she was remembered. The sun had fully risen by the time Elena stepped out of the diner. The storm's aftermath shimmered across the street, puddles reflecting fragments of sky, the faint hum of morning traffic carrying life forward as if nothing monumental had happened within those four walls. Yet something had shifted. In her, in the people inside, maybe even in the town itself. The general's car was already gone, but his presence lingered like an echo. For a long while, she stood there on the sidewalk, the wind tugging gently at her jacket, her eyes tracing the horizon that had so often called her away, and now finally seemed to call her home. The commendation coin lay in her pocket, heavy and cold against her palm, a reminder of a life both lived and lost in service. She began to walk, slowly, deliberately, down the quiet street that led toward the small Veterans Memorial at the town square. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming magnolia. It was a smell she hadn't noticed in years. Too often, her memories had been filled with smoke, dust, diesel, and the scent of rain falling on foreign soil. When she reached the memorial, she paused before the stone. It was small, modest, names carved with precision, though many had faded from the touch of weather and time. She knelt, brushing away a film of damp leaves, and found one name she hadn't spoken aloud in decades. "Captain J. Reeve," she murmured, her breath catching slightly. "You were right." The world forgets fast. She stayed there for a while, long enough for the breeze to dry her tears. Around her, the town began to stir. School buses groaning down side streets, the distant bark of a dog, the sound of someone unlocking a storefront. Life resumed as it always did. But not far behind her. Footsteps approached. "Eleanor," she turned. It was the young soldier from the diner, the one who had approached her earlier, his face still carrying that uncertain respect of someone realizing he was in the presence of something larger than himself. He held out a small, folded newspaper. "They printed it," he said quietly. She frowned slightly and unfolded the paper. The headline wasn't loud or dramatic. Local veteran aides in late-night rescue. There was no mention of her rank, her medals, her history. Just a simple account of the storm, the accident, and the mysterious woman who'd helped save a life before fading into the rain. Her first instinct was to hand it back. But the young man hesitated. "Ma'am, people are talking. Not just about the rescue, about who you are. The general came back this morning. Said your name out loud in the briefing at the base." She looked at him sharply. "He did what?" The soldier smiled faintly. "Said you taught him everything he knows about leadership. Said the army forgot someone it never should have." For the first time, Elena was speechless. Her throat tightened, and she could only shake her head slowly. "He didn't have to." "No, ma'am," the soldier interrupted gently. "He did." He straightened his posture then, almost unconsciously, and saluted her, not out of obligation, but reverence. The gesture was clean, sharp, genuine. Elena's hand rose in return, steady and sure. It felt different this time, not like reliving the past, but honoring it. The soldier nodded once, lowered his hand and walked away. She watched him go, her chest heavy with something that wasn't quite pride, wasn't quite sorrow, something deeper. When he disappeared around the corner, Elena turned back to the memorial. She took the coin from her pocket and placed it gently at the base of the stone. "For all of you," she whispered. "For everything we carried." Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked away. That evening, she found herself back at the diner, though it looked different now. Someone had cleaned the windows. The waitress smiled when she entered, genuine and warm. The young soldiers stood to greet her, offering her the corner booth before returning to their seats. The owner, once curt and distracted, poured her coffee himself. "You're becoming famous around here," he said, trying for humor but sounding almost reverent. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Let's hope not." He hesitated, then added, "You changed the way people look at this place, at each other." She stirred her coffee. "I didn't change anything. I just reminded them." As night fell, the diner filled again. Laughter, the clink of dishes, the low hum of life returning. But beneath it all was something new, a current of quiet respect. Every now and then, someone would glance toward Elena, not out of curiosity, but gratitude. When the bell above the door jingled again, she looked up instinctively. For a fleeting second, she thought the general had returned. But it was only a stranger, pausing to nod respectfully before finding a seat. Still, that single nod carried the weight of something she'd long stopped believing in, acknowledgement. Later, as she left, the town bathed in amber streetlight. Elena paused once more outside the diner. Her reflection in the glass looked softer now. Older, yes, but lighter somehow. The storm was gone, but the market left behind had turned into something beautiful. She thought of the young woman in the wreck, alive because someone had remembered how to act when no one else did. She thought of the general's salute, of the soldier's trembling voice, of all the names carved in stone. And she realized something that had taken her a lifetime to understand. Respect is not given by the crowd. It's earned in silence, held by those who understand, and passed down quietly, from one steady hand to another. As she walked home, the stars began to pierce the sky, faint, flickering, resilient. And somewhere, deep within her heart, Elena Ward, the woman who had once been forgotten, finally allowed herself to rest, knowing the world had remembered after all. Not because she demanded it, but because she deserved it. And sometimes that's all a soldier ever needs.